Welcome, Gov. Take it away, Gov.
All right, thank you, Ellie. Great to be here again. See some of you guys. Saw you a couple of days ago, some of them. It's great. I have like plenty of time now to take my time talking about this new law and this new form. First, I like to put things in perspective. Obviously, we're in a, there's the issue of fires. Fires is a big issue in a lot of places in California, including this area. And I think the big idea is we should do whatever we can to be as safe as we possibly can in a fire situation. And two of the things that you can do are fire hardening your home, and number two, making sure you have defensible space. Now, the fire hardening at this point is generally just something you are recommended to do, whereas defensible space is something that you're actually required to do. And all of that was true before this law and this form ever came around. I mean, we all should be thinking about fire hardening, and we all have to think about defensible space. I mean, it's in our interest to think about it. Plus, there's already existing laws, state and local, that require you to have defensible space. The only thing really new about this law is the government decided we need to get this information out to people. In other words, maybe not enough people are actually thinking about fire hardening or thinking about or being aware of defensible space. So how are we going to get this information out to people? And the way they decided to do it is we're going to have a transaction, a sale of property trigger certain things. Trigger basically disclosure and trigger some other obligations. So in other words, I always think the big picture is we should all have defensible space. We should all have fire hardening. But now there's a new law. There's actually two new laws that actually force people to think about it. You know what I mean? And maybe, and actually in some circumstances, force them to actually do something, okay? But even if this law never happened, there are these requirements to have defensible space. This law doesn't add any requirements to have defensible space that weren't there before. All it does is add an obligation in certain circumstances to actually try to reach out and get documentation that you have it. But you're supposed to have it regardless. But anyway, another thing, just the big perspective is, from your perspective is, okay, so now this is something you got to worry about. This is a disclosure you have to worry about when you sell houses, which means for the first time in about 15 years, we have a new disclosure form. For the last 15 years, if somebody asked me, Gov, I'm listing a house, what are the disclosure forms I got to give to the buyer? I would have said, basically, there's 5 things you have to think about: an NHD report, a TDS, a seller property questionnaire, a lead paint form, and some disclosure booklets. NHD, TDS, SBQ, lead, and booklets. 5 things. Well, you know what? Now there are 6. There is a new mandatory 6th disclosure form that you got to deal with when you take a listing in California. Okay, so that's what we're talking about today. This new mandatory form that basically deals with this stuff. What's different, by the way, about this disclosure form rather than the other 5 is, unlike the other 5, this one is only required if the house you have listed is in a high or very high fire zone. I mean, all those other forms I mentioned are required no matter what type of zone you're in. Obviously, the lead paint form is only required if you're pre-78. By the way, quick review. Of those 5 things I mentioned before, the TDS, the SPQ, and the booklets are required on residential 1 to 4, not required in probate, REO, bankruptcy, or trust sales. The lead paint form has no exemptions, but it's only required in pre-78 houses. So you still got to do it in probate, REO, bankruptcy, trust. And then, of course, the NHD is required on all transactions, commercial, residential, improved, unimproved, there's no exceptions. So this new form, this sixth form, where does that fit in? Well, it's connected with the TDS. So it's like the TDS SPQ in the booklets. It's not required in a probate, REO, bankruptcy sale or a trust sale unless the trustee used to be on title or lived there in the last 12 months. So it's connected. Think of it as connected with a TDS. If a TDS is required, this form is required. If a TDS is not required, this form is not required. But of course, the special thing about this form is it's only required in a house that you're selling that's in a high or very high fire zone. Remember, if you live in California, there's 4 possibilities. You're not in a fire zone, you're in a moderate fire zone, you're in a high fire zone, you're in a very high. This form is only required in the last 2, high or very high. So Ellie, if you don't mind just sharing the form on the screen so we can just look at it as we're going here. First thing to think about is whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. This form combines 2 laws into one. They're 2 completely separate laws. They're both related to fire, but they're separate. One is the fire hardening law, and one is the defensible space law. Now, what they have in common is they're both triggered by a sale of residential 1 to 4. So that was built before, that's in a high or very high zone. So if you're not in a high or very high zone, neither one of those laws applies, which means the form doesn't apply. Now, as you probably know, for the last 6 months, the fire hardening law has been in effect, but the defensible space law has only been in effect for, a couple of weeks. So for the first 6 months of the year, there was this form called the Home Fire Hardening Advisory, HHDA. But that's now been gone, and now it's replaced by this form. The first 3 paragraphs of this form is what used to be the home hardening form. So this form replaces and incorporates that form, and then it has a new paragraph 4 that deals with the other law, the defensible space law, which I'll talk about. But neither one of these laws is in effect unless your listing is in a high or very high. By the way, this does apply to only residential 1 to 4. If it's more than 4 units, you don't do it. If it's raw land, commercial, you don't do it. Does it apply to condos? Yes. Does it apply to mobile homes? Yes. Okay. So first thing you got to realize, the way I like to say this is listing agents, there's like 4 things you got to do now you didn't have to do before. And buyer's agents, there's 1 thing you have to do that you didn't have to do before. So let's start with the listing agent. What do you got to do that you didn't have to do before? Well, number 1, every time you take a listing, you got to determine if your listing is in a high or very high fire zone. Because if it is, you got to do this form. So how do I figure that out? Well, fortunately, we've already got this disclosure law called the NHD, Natural Hazard Disclosure, which will help you out. Because on that form itself, on the NHD form, part of the report you all order, there are 2 fire zones, which might be checked or not checked. Well, let's say you get an NHD and neither, one says very high fire zone, one says wildland fire area. Let's say your NHD report, neither one of those boxes is checked. You're not in a fire zone, you don't worry about it. Let's say the very high fire zone box is checked on the NHD. Well, obviously you're in a very high fire zone, so you got to do this form. But what if on the NHD report, the very high fire box is not checked, but the wildland fire area box is checked? What is that telling you? That's telling you you're in a moderate or a high fire zone. But I just got through telling you this form is only required if you're in a high. It's not required if you're in a moderate. But the NHD report didn't tell me if I'm in a, it told me that I'm either in one of those two. So how do I know if I'm in a high versus a moderate? The best advice is you just push your NHD company a little further. Just ask them, just say, which one am I in? They will tell you. They have that information. I mean, you could try to do it yourself, look at the CAL FIRE maps. I wouldn't recommend that. I'd make the NHD company can tell you which one you're in, and they will tell you which one you're in. So, like I said, if neither box is checked, you know you don't need this form. If the very high fire zone box is checked on the NHD, you need this form. If the wildland fire box is checked, you have to dig a little deeper with your NHD company to find out. Now, having said that, some sellers and listing agents may take the position that, you know, I think I want to provide this form even if we're just in a moderate zone. That's why there's paragraph 2 you're looking at there, right? Because even though this form is only required in a high or very high, some sellers may choose to provide the form voluntarily, even though they don't have to, because they're in a moderate zone. Or maybe they're just in a fire-prone area that hasn't been mapped yet to be even in a moderate zone. And there are places like that. So that's why some sellers may check paragraph 2B, and they're just providing that information voluntarily as an advisory, okay? But let's say you only want to provide the form if you have to. Well, then you're going to determine if you're in a high or very high. And if you're in a high or very high, you're going to provide the form. Now, what does that mean? Okay, so remember I said the first thing listing agents have to figure out now is, are you in a high or very high? You figure that out. You are, you provide the form. You know what the next thing you got to do on your new 4-point checklist? You have to figure out how old the house is that you have listed. Why is that important? Because the fire hardening part of this form only applies to sales of houses built before 2010. So let's say I've determined I'm in a high or very high, so I pull out this form. But then I realized the house was built after 2010. It was built 2012, 2015, 2018. 1, 2, and 3 are not required anymore. I mean, you're still going to do the form because paragraph 4 is required on all sales in high or very high, regardless of when the house was built. But paragraphs 1, 2, and 3 are only required if the house is built before 2010. What that really means is the seller only has to answer those questions in 3B if the house was built before 2010, which makes sense. You know why? Everything that was built in a fire zone after 2010 was built under the new building code, which says if you build in a high or very high, you can't have a wood roof. You have to have dual pane windows. Yet you have to have ventilation in the roof less than 1/8 of an inch. In other words, those questions in paragraph 3B aren't even going to be relevant if you built a house after 2010 because it's going to be built a certain way. Okay, so number 1, you figured out you're in a high or very high. So you pull out the form. Number 2, let's say you determine that the property was built before 2010. So you ask your seller to check those boxes and B, whichever ones are relevant. So paragraph 1 is just pure information. Paragraph 2 is just for the seller who wants to provide the form. You're telling the buyer, hey, buyer, don't get excited. Just because I'm giving you this form, you're not in a high or very high zone. I just want to give you this form because I think it's good. And then paragraph 3, 3A is sort of the statutory notice, and paragraph 3B is the seller required to check boxes. But this is just a disclosure, right? The seller doesn't have to do anything. What if the buyer says, oh, thanks for telling me you have a wood roof. I need you to change out the roof. Seller can say, no, I don't have to do that. I've got to tell you this, but I don't have to do anything. You don't like it, don't buy my house. You buy it, you could change the roof, but I don't have to change the windows. I don't have to change the gutter covers. I don't have to do anything. It's a pure disclosure. I'm telling you what I have to tell you. I'm basically sort of recommending this whole idea of fire hardening if I haven't done it myself. Okay, so that's it. Pure disclosure. You're done. You're done with the fire hardening. Now, but then we have a whole nother law that took effect July 1st, and that's defensible space, and that's paragraph 4. So remember, going back to my listing agent checklist, the first thing I've determined is I'm in a high or very high, so I've got to have this form. Number 2, I figured out whether the house was built before or after 2010, which is going to determine whether my seller has to check those boxes or not. But now we're up to defensible space, paragraph 4. What's the third thing that I got to do as a listing agent? You have to figure out if where you have this listing, if there is a local defensible space or vegetation management ordinance in addition to the California one. So California has this law. It's mentioned in paragraph 4A, PRC code 4291, which requires, if you're in a high or very high, that you have 100 foot of defensible space. That's California law. You're required to do that. You're required to have. That's nothing new. That's been around for a while. But if you look at paragraph 4B, B1, 2, 3, 4, Carl, absolutely required by a FSBO. Absolutely. That's why everybody needs a realtor. This is definitely required. So if you look at 4B, if you want to just scroll up a little bit, Ellie, there are 4 choices. So I think a little bit down so we can see all 4 at the same time. Beautiful, perfect, right there. So the third thing that a listing agent and seller have to figure out is which one of those 4 paragraphs under B is the right one. In other words, am I going to check the box in 2? Am I going to check the box in 3? Am I going to check the box in 4? Or am I not going to check any box, which defaults to 1? So remember I said you got this new checklist of things you got to do. And the third thing on your checklist is you have to figure out whether there is a local ordinance or not, which is going to help me determine which box to check. Okay. So how on earth do I figure out if my county or my city has some type of local vegetation management or defensible space ordinance? All I can tell you is, you know what I do? I call CAL FIRE. I call the local CAL FIRE office. They know. They know if the county that you're in has a special local rule in addition to the state rule. You can also call your local fire company. They know too. And we've been doing a lot of calling. We know that Mendocino has one, and Napa has one, and Marin has one, and Sonoma has one. I know San Bernardino County has one, certain parts. I actually don't know yet about the counties where you are. So you would probably know better than me. All you got to do is call CAL FIRE. And they know. They really know. Or you can Google it. I mean, the point is, you can figure out if your county, in other words, maybe the state says, you can look at the PRC code. It tells you, okay, you got to have, the grass can't be more than 4 inches or whatever. The trees got to be a certain distance apart, whatever. But it's possible that your local area could say, well, that's not strict enough for us. We think the grass should be even at a lower level. We think the trees should be even further apart. In other words, counties and cities have the right to be stricter, if they want to be, than the state regarding defensible space. But just because your county has a local law doesn't necessarily mean you're going to check the box in B3 or B4. Because the only time you got to check the box in B3 or B4 is if not only does your county have a local ordinance, but that local ordinance actually requires you to do something other than be in compliance. For example, I have already checked Mendocino, Marin, Mendocino, Sonoma, and Napa. They all have local ordinances, but those local ordinances don't require the seller to do something at point of sale. And they don't require the buyer to do something right after the sale. They just say, you need to comply with this law. Same thing in San Bernardino County. They say, okay, if you're in certain parts of San Bernardino County, you got to follow this law, but it doesn't say you have to get documentation that you did it. It just says do it. So in other words, in Sonoma, Mendocino, Napa, even though they have a local ordinance, they don't check the boxes in 3 or 4. Now, gentlemen, I think it might have been Carl was mentioning before this that Paradise may actually have some type of point of sale thing you got to do, right? I mean, that's for, unfortunately, you guys to figure out is if your community says something like, oh, you want to sell a house here, you got to get a statement of compliance from the county that you're in compliance or you can't sell it or something like that. By the way, the only place that I've verified in this whole state that requires that at this point is Truckee. I don't know about Paradise. I haven't checked that out yet. But the point is, like I said, my third thing on your checklist is to figure out, does my community have a local ordinance that actually requires, look at number 3. Does the buyer have, does there a local ordinance that permits compliance? Buyers shall obtain documentation of compliance. In other words, is there a local law that requires the buyer to do that? Or number 4, like Truckee, is there actually a law that says if you want to sell the house, the sale triggers an obligation to get some type of documentation of compliance? By the way, some places like down in Big Bear, they come out and inspect every year, but they don't give you any statements. They only give you a statement if you're not in compliance. They don't require you to get a statement of compliance. All they say is, hey, you're not in compliance, you better fix it. So even in Big Bear, that doesn't require you to check box 3 or 4. You only check box 3 or 4, once again, is if you have a local law that specifically says, hey, either, hey, seller, before you can sell in this area, you gotta get an inspection and get a compliance statement. Or number 4, buyer, if you buy a house in this area, you got to go get a compliance statement in 2 months or something like that. Let's assume that that's not the case. Let's assume that you do not have a local law that specifically requires you to do something as far as getting documentation, which in my experience is that's most of the state. Most of the state has no local law that requires you to get documentation in connection with a sale, which means most of your deals are going to be B1 or B2. So remember I said there's 4 things you got to do, listing agent. Number 1, we figured out we're in a high or very high, and that determines whether we actually need this form. Number 2, we figured out if the house is older or newer than 2010, which determines whether the seller has to answer the questions in number 3. The third thing I got to figure out is there a local ordinance requiring the seller or the buyer to do something? And I'm going to say chances are that's not going to be the case, which takes us to B1 or B2. What's the 4th and final thing I got to figure out? I got to figure out whether I'm supposed to check B1 or B2. You're only going to check here's what you're going to do. You're going to ask your seller, hey, seller, in the last 6 months, did some government agency come out to your property, like CAL FIRE, check you out for defensible space, find out that you were okay, and give you some type of documentation to that effect? You're going to ask the seller that question. Most of your sellers are going to say no. I mean, even if you were down in Big Bear, where they do an annual inspection, they still don't give you a statement of compliance. All they do is they tell you if you're in violation. So I'm guessing 95% of the time, at least, when you ask your seller, hey, have you obtained documentation from any government agency? They're going to say, nope, sure didn't. Which means 95% of your sales, you're not going to check the box in 2, 3, or 4. You're going to default to 1. Now, maybe what Carl said earlier, maybe that's different in Paradise. Maybe they do have a point of sale thing you got to do, in which case you may be checking 4B4 in Paradise. But in general, as far as I know, and you would know otherwise, most of your sales are going to be B1. And because there's no local ordinance requiring special documentation. Yes, Kirsten, definitely the seller fills this out. Thanks for pointing that out. I'm just saying they're going to look at you, the listing agent, for help. And you definitely have a fiduciary duty to your seller to help them understand this form. I mean, we can't get around that. In other words, yes, seller fills this out, not you, but you have a fiduciary duty to be able to, because they're going to look at you and say, what box do I check? If you want to dump it on them, say, go ahead, you figure it out. I wouldn't recommend that. So anyway, okay, so you figured out that B1 is the relevant one, which means you're not going to check the boxes in 2, 3, or 4. You're not checking any box. You're just giving the form to the buyer. Listing agent, you've done your job. You have completed the form. You've provided the form, and you've not checked any of the boxes in paragraph 4. Now we go to the buyer's agent. What's your job? Well, even though we don't like to admit it, California law says when you represent a buyer and they receive any disclosure form, you have a fiduciary duty to your buyer to explain the form they just got. It's not the listing agent's job to explain to the buyer what this form means. It's the buyer's agent's job to explain to the buyer. So I'm thinking most of the time when you're a buyer's agent and you get and you get this form, you're going to look at paragraph B. You're going to notice that none of the boxes are checked. So you're going to tell your buyer, that means you got to do B1, buyer. Look what B1 says. B1 says, buyer, you've just agreed to obtain documentation of compliance within a year after close. So the buyer has just committed to do something. They've committed that within a year after close, they are going to reach out and get some government agency. It says authorized inspector. That means CAL FIRE, county fire department, city fire department, not just some private individual. They're agreeing that within a year, they're going to reach out to CAL FIRE or some local company to have them come out so they can get documentation of compliance. Okay, that's the big thing. Buyers are required to do something. And of course, they're going to ask you, what do I do? How do I do that? Here's the advice I would give the buyer. I would say, well, once this closes, just call your local CAL FIRE office. And they will tell you. And you say, call CAL FIRE and say, hey, I just bought a house. Could you please come out and check it out and give me documentation? CAL FIRE is ready for this phone call. CAL FIRE is aware of this law. CAL FIRE has hired a bunch of inspectors. But what if you call CAL FIRE and they say, you know, we'd like to help, but you're not in our jurisdiction. You're not in a state fire area, and we haven't contracted with the locals, so we'd like to help, but we don't do it. We don't do inspections in your area. So the buyer says, well, how am I going to do this? How do I go get some inspection if CAL FIRE won't do it? Well, that means you're in a local fire area, local responsibility area. So now you're going to call your local fire company and say, I just bought a house in this very high area. So I'm required to call you up and have you come out and inspect the property so you can give me a statement of compliance. Now, what if you call the local fire company and they say, yeah, we're not going to do that. We don't have the resources for that. Sometimes we do random inspections. Sometimes we respond to complaints. But we're not just going to come out and inspect your property just because you want us to. If they say that, as a buyer, you just say, okay, got it, thank you. What's your name again? John Smith. Let me just write that down. You're going to write down John Smith. I talked to John Smith on July 15th. He told me they're not going to do it. I'm done. The buyer is done now. They don't have to do anything. They tried. They tried CAL FIRE and they tried the local. No one's willing to come out and do it. They did their best. They're done. There is no authorized inspector willing to do this. So they're done. They don't have to do anything. One question people ask is, should the buyer try to arrange for this before escrow closes? Should they try to arrange to have CAL FIRE come out or local company coming out before close of escrow? Well, remember the purchase contract says in paragraph 12, the buyer is not allowed to call out any government inspectors without the seller's permission. So if the buyer buyer couldn't do this before close unless the seller said, go ahead and do it. Seller may say, no, I don't want you calling them out here. I don't want them coming out before close of escrow and seeing I'm not in compliance, get me in trouble. No, you've agreed to do it after close. So no, you can't do it. Okay. By the way, after close, do you as a buyer's agent have any obligation to make sure the buyer does what they promised to do? Absolutely not. Listing agent, do you have any obligation to make sure the buyer does what they promised to do? Absolutely not. Your duty is over when escrow closes. I'm just saying, as a buyer's agent, your fiduciary duty to the buyer is to make them understand the disclosure forms that they've received. And this is a disclosure form that they've received. So you have to make them understand what they have to do. I'm going to get your questions in 1 second, but here's a complicating thing. CAL FIRE interprets this law a little bit different than we do. We've been talking to them a lot. We talked to them yesterday, yesterday before. They've somehow got it into their head, although we're trying to convince them that they're clearly wrong. They somehow got it into their head that this law requires the seller to do an inspection before close of escrow. That is not true. I am your lawyer guaranteeing that. I know I'm being recorded. This is absolutely not true. But I don't think CAL FIRE is going to push this. They're not going to start calling you up and say, hey, first of all, how are they going to even know if you're in escrow? They're not. It's absolutely not true. Sellers do not have to do anything. They absolutely just don't have to do it. CAL FIRE is trying to say that, but the law doesn't say that. You know what our concern is, though? CAL FIRE may say, but I think they should do that. So CAL FIRE may try to push to get a regulation passed requiring sellers to do that. But don't let anyone tell you different. This law does not require a seller to do any type of inspection just because they're selling the house, unless you're in Truckee, or unless maybe you're in Paradise, maybe there are other places where there's a local rule. But state law, which is what CAL FIRE enforces, absolutely does not require sellers to do anything. It really doesn't. Okay, I just want you to be aware of that. But we're going to monitor this, because I would not be at all surprised if CAL FIRE doesn't now push for a regulation. Because remember, government agencies like the IRS or any DRE, they can try to get their own regulations passed that supplement the law. They haven't done it yet. Who knows? We're going to monitor it very carefully, but as of right now, absolutely, sellers do not have to get inspections unless you have a local rule that requires it. Okay. All right. Now let me go to your questions. And I can see they're good questions. Okay. If someone asked me, yes, this is required on FSBOs. Yes, the seller fills it out, not you. Beverly, do you want to unmute yourself? Maybe to make it, I'm not sure exactly what you're asking me.
I've got a report that says that this property is not in a high fire hazard area, but it is in a wildfire.
Wildland, yeah.
And that is checked. So how do I go over again how I ferret out whether that disclosure should be done on this or not?
Right, right. So in other words, the very high was not checked. The wildland fire area was checked.
Correct.
That tells you that you're in a moderate or a high.
Right.
You want to know which one is it?
Yes.
And what I said is push the NHD company to tell you. What if you are running into an NHD company that says, nah, we gave you what we gave you, that's all we're going to give you? Well, you can be conservative and provide the form anyway, or call the legal hotline. We'll help you figure out how to, I mean, they're maps you actually can look at. They're maps that can tell you. But my experience with NHD companies is that they are willing to help you with that. Although I think one of you asked a question below. Diane says, I just asked NHD company and they just sent me a map. It's not your job to figure that out. It is the seller's job to figure that out, but I would probably go to a different NHD company, because there are definitely NHD companies out there who will take it upon themselves. They're not going to say, you look at the map. They're going to actually tell you, okay, we will look at the map and we will tell you if you're in a moderate or a high. So I'm surprised that you ran into an NHD company that said, here's the map, you look at it. I'd say that's why I'm paying you. I mean, we're paying for this report. I want you to tell me this. Do they have to tell you that by law? No. By law, all they have to tell you is you're in a very high, or you're in a wildland, which means moderate or high. But I would think they would want your business enough to go the next step and tell you that. Okay. Anyway. Carl, thanks. CAL FIRE has an online form. Ron, good question. What if the seller doesn't provide the form in the first 7 days? Well, this is just like every other disclosure. Seller is supposed to provide it within 7 days. If the seller doesn't give it to you in 7 days, they're in violation. But what does that mean? I mean, I guess the buyer could cancel the deal. Does the buyer really want to cancel the deal? Probably not. They want the house. So it really doesn't, it's not really a big deal that the seller's late. What if the seller closes the escrow and never gives you this form? Then that's a problem. Then the buyer can say, no one ever told me I have to do this in a year, so I don't have to do it. And then the sellers may have some liability for not telling the buyer that they had this responsibility to do something within a year. So once again, if the seller is just late providing the form, by the way, remember when the buyer gets this form, they can back out of the deal. It's like the TDS, it's like the NHD, it's like the lead paint. It gives the buyer a right of rescission. So as a seller, I want to give this form to the buyer as soon as I can, just like all the other forms. But to answer your question, Ron, if the seller doesn't do it in 7 days, all that does is it extends the buyer's right to cancel. But as long as they give it to him before close, they've given it to him, and the buyer can't say, well, nobody told me what I'm supposed to do. Well, they told you. They just were late, okay? But if the seller never gives them the form, the buyer can say, no one ever told me I had to go out and get this documentation, so I don't have to do it. And they're right. Okay, I got a direct message from someone, they have a big farm. Isn't this interesting? What if, imagine you have a farm, huge farm, it's got a residence on it. The residence is not in a fire zone, but part of the farm is. All that matters is the residence in the fire zone. If the residence is not in a fire zone, you don't need the form. I don't care if part of the property is. Lori, good question. Should we anticipate buyers including in an offer that the seller is responsible?
Yes.
I guess what you're asking is buyers writing an offer that says, hey, seller, before I buy your property, I need you to go out and get some certification that the property's in compliance. Otherwise, I'm not going to buy your house. Yep, I think buyers could do that. Most of this state is a real seller's market now. I think buyers aren't going to do this because they want the house. But you're absolutely right. I can see buyers writing in the offers, I'm not going to buy your house unless you reach out to CAL FIRE and you get the certification before I even buy your house. By the way, CAL FIRE would love that because CAL FIRE thinks sellers have to do that anyway, which they don't. But CAL FIRE would love it if buyers do that because then sellers are going to do what CAL FIRE thinks they should be doing anyway. Kirsten, how does this apply to cabins on U.S. Forest Service leased land? All I can tell you is, yeah, it applies to those. It's in other words, this law applies on all types of land, Forest Service land, federal land, doesn't matter. That doesn't determine whether you got to comply with this law. Melissa, very good question. Getting back to the home hardening. Seller has no clue how to answer those questions on paragraph 3. You know, they're answering to the best of their ability. If they don't know, they don't know. They're not going to check the box. I guess the worst thing that can happen is the buyer buys the house and says, hey, I just bought your house and I figured out that you don't have dual pane windows. Why didn't you check the box telling me you didn't have dual pane windows? And the seller says, I don't even know what that means. That's why I didn't answer it. I mean, is the buyer going to be able to sue the seller saying, I know you must have known what you were doing? How is a judge going to even react to that? Are they going to say to the seller, you must have known that? How can you not know what kind of windows you have? I have no idea how that's going to work out. All I can tell you is sellers are supposed to answer to the best of their knowledge. What if the seller lives in Texas? They've never seen the house. Well, then they obviously can't answer those questions, right? I mean, I don't know what to tell you. Dana, would it make sense to always fill this out to avoid making a mistake and finding out after the fact? Dana, can you unmute yourself and explain what you mean by always filling this out? You mean filling out the form? I mean, if you're asking me whether or not you have to fill out the form, in other words, if you're not sure if you're in a high or very high, yeah, it's safer to do the form. You're right, if that's what you're asking me. Thank you, Lisa and Wendy, for pointing out NHD companies that will do this for you. Brandy, and thanks for asking that. This form, this is a complicating thing. This form is required on all sales of in a high or very high. It's just that paragraph 3 of the form only needs to be filled out on a pre-2010. But the form itself is required no matter when the house was built. It's just the fire hardening part, which is paragraph 1, 2, and 3, that's only required on a house built before 2010. But the defensible space part, that's required no matter when the house was built. One of the many confusing things here. Yes, I know. Thank you, Sherry. CAL FIRE says it on their actual page that statement, which I am telling you as your lawyer, and I'm being recorded, and we have it in writing, that's simply not true. That's not what the law says. The law does not, we told CAL FIRE this. And if they have any sense, they'll figure out that we're right, because we are absolutely right. There is nothing in the law that requires the seller to do that. They would like it to be that. And by the way, maybe that's in big picture, that's probably a good thing. I think we all would want to know if if I were a buyer, I'd want to know. But the law doesn't require the seller to tell me. All the law requires to do is the seller to tell me that I've got to do something in a year. I'm just telling you, that's what it says. Lori, yes, I don't know if the NHG company is going to put it in an email. I don't know how they're going to tell you. Some NHG companies have actually modified their form to tell you whether it's moderate or high fire. Dana, yes. When in doubt, do the form. It's always safer. Kirsten, excellent question about paragraph RPA 7B2. If that's checked, does this transfer the responsibility to the seller? What she's referring to is that clause in the purchase contract about deciding who's going to do mandatory retrofits. And the answer is that does not transfer the responsibility to the seller, because this is not a mandatory retrofit. This is a mandatory go out and get statement of compliance. I know what you're thinking. Yeah, but what if I can't get the statement of compliance without doing some work? Nevertheless, this law doesn't require the work to be done. So what I'm saying is, even if the buyer checks paragraph 7B2, this does not shift the responsibility to the seller. The buyer would have to be very specific in the offer. The buyer would have to say, seller, my offer, part of my offer is you need to make sure the property's in compliance with defensible space, and I also want documentation to that effect. If that's what you want as a buyer, you got to spell that out. You can't just check the box on 7B2. Deirdre, very good question. Yes, this law applies not just to escrows that start July 1st, it applies to escrows closing after July 1st. So let's say you've been in an escrow since June and you haven't closed yet, give them the form. I hate to tell you that, but you got to give the buyer the form before close. Kirsten, I know what you're saying. I'm just telling you that's the way that language is interpreted. Here's a good one, Ron. Seller refuses to provide the form, and we let the buyer know. Can the buyer come back against their agent? No, I mean, I think, okay, first of all, as a buyer's agent, part of your job representing a buyer is to make sure that your buyer receives from the seller the forms that the seller is supposed to give you. And now, remember, it's always been those 5 forms: NHD, TDS, SPQ, lead paint, if it's pre-78, and booklets. Well, now it's your job as a buyer's agent to make sure your buyer gets this form also, if the property's in a high or very high. So what if you're representing the buyer and you don't get this form? It's not your fault, it's the seller's fault. Maybe the seller determined it wasn't in a high or very high. So, I mean, how do you know what the seller figured out? Of course, if you get an NHD from the seller and they checked very high, and then you don't get this form, you're going to point out to your buyer, you know, that NHD report they gave you says they're in a very high. They should have given you this form. I'm just telling you, they didn't give it to you. What does that mean? That means the seller's violating the law. But there's no liability on the buyer's agent. You can't force the seller. You can't force the seller to to do things they're supposed to do. I think if the seller doesn't provide this form, the seller has potential liability from CAL FIRE for not informing the buyer of what the buyer's obligations are. Christina, the form states buyer has to do it within a year. If the seller provides a statement during escrow, I'm assuming, Christina, you mean a statement of compliance issued by a government fire company that the property's in compliance. Remember, if that's the case, then we're going to check paragraph 4B2, and the seller's just going to give it to the buyer. So in other words, your scenario means that it's a 4B2 case where the seller actually has a compliance statement. So they're just going to check 4B2 and give it to the buyer. Buyer doesn't have to do anything, right? Like I said, that'll probably happen sometimes. Allison, great question, which I was about to get to. Okay, so let's assume that it's 4B1. Seller provides the form to the buyer, and the buyer signs it. By signing the form, is the buyer agreeing to do this, or do you need a separate agreement for the buyer to comply? The answer is you do not need a separate agreement, because look at the title of the form at the very top. It says advisory disclosure and addendum. It actually is an addendum. That's why you don't need a separate form. When the buyer signs this form, they're agreeing to whatever they agree. They're agreeing to 4B1. They're agreeing to do it. Which leads me to the next question. Ron, you were asking, what if the seller doesn't provide the form? What about the other way? What if the seller provides the form and the buyer won't sign it? We all agreed if the buyer signs it, they've agreed to it, it's an addendum, it's great. But what if the seller does the right thing, provides the form, 4B1, buyer to do it, and buyer says, I'm not signing your dumb form because I don't want to do that the next year. What do you do as a seller if the buyer won't sign the form? Remember, the purchase contract says, paragraph 14, buyer must sign and return all disclosures, the statutory disclosures, TDS, lead paint, NHD, and this one. This is a statutory disclosure that the buyer has to sign and return. It's a statutory disclosure, gives the buyer the 5-day right of rescission. So what do I do as a seller? I've given the form to the buyer won't sign it. Well, I got to think about that, because that's another thing we asked CAL FIRE. Said, hey, CAL FIRE, the buyer doesn't sign this form. Do you think the obligation goes back on the seller? Of course, they said yes, because they think the seller has the obligation anyway. Yes, Sean, you'd first give the buyer a notice to buyer to perform. Say, hey, buyer, we gave you this form. You're supposed to return it. You didn't return it. You got 2 days to return it. Buyer still doesn't do it. What do you do as a seller with a buyer who refuses to sign this form? Well, conservative Gov, who gives conservative legal advice, would say to the seller, maybe you don't want to sell to this buyer, because you could get in trouble after close because you never got the buyer to agree to do this. Do I honestly think CAL FIRE is going to come after sellers for not getting buyers to sign this form? I don't think so. I don't think they have the authority to, but I'm conservative. And I always am conservative on the side of want you to be safe, want your clients to be safe. So if I were advising a seller and the buyer wouldn't sign this form, it's easy for me to say, because my focus is risk management. It's easy for me to say, seller, don't sell them the house, sell to somebody else. Now, go ahead, Allison, if you're going to comment on that. Or no, okay. So yeah, so that's a problem if buyer won't sign it. Some sellers are going to say, I don't care if they sign it, I'm going to sell them the house anyway. Is there a big risk to the seller for that? I personally don't think so, but you never know. There could be a risk if you sell the house to the buyer without the buyer agreeing to this. By the way, there's another way to handle this, because what I've just described is you're providing this disclosure like you provide the other disclosures, and you're hoping the buyer will sign. If they don't sign, you give them a notice to perform. They still don't do it, you can cancel them. You know what else you could do? You could just attach this form to a counteroffer and say, buyer, here's the counteroffer. The counteroffer is you need to sign this form. If you don't sign this form, you're not accepting my counteroffer. We don't have a deal. And then you don't have to worry about trying to give them a notice to perform later and canceling them later. You're simply given it's part of the counteroffer. You need to sign this form. By the way, you could do that with all the disclosure forms. My counteroffer is you sign all these TDS and everything. I want them signed right now. Otherwise, forget, we don't have a deal. But anyway, that might work for this, okay? Doug, very, very good point here. Robert, well, first, before I do that, Robert, wouldn't you do an amendment if already in contract? So I think what you're asking me, Robert, perhaps is, what if you're in one of those situations where this escrow opened before July 1st and you didn't use this form, and now you want to use this form? Technically, isn't that an amendment rather than an addendum? You're exactly right. But you know what, Robert, I'm glad you actually know all that. But in this case, I would say you could still use this form as an addendum. You are absolutely right, Robert. Legally, it's considered to be an amendment if it happens once you're already in contract. It's an addendum if it's something you agree before you actually have a binding contract. Nevertheless, in this case, I think you can use this form, even though it says addendum rather than amendment, it's still okay to do it. Now, you know what the underlying issue here, right, counter would be too late if you're already in contract. Good point, absolutely, you're absolutely right. All right, but you know what I think, and this is a good thing to sort of end on, the overriding issue here is insurance. You know what I'm surprised about all these years I've been doing this? I'm surprised that insurance companies have not always said to buyers, or at least recently, hey buyer, you're buying a house in a high or very high, and you want insurance on this property? You know what? We're only going to give you insurance is if you verify before close that this property has the proper defensible space. Aren't you wondering why insurance companies don't do that already? My guess is they may start doing that. If they start doing that, who cares about this law? No one's going to care about this law at all, because it's just going to come down to, if I want the house, I want insurance. And if I don't have defensible space, they're not going to give me insurance. I would not be at all, and I've heard some insurance companies actually doing this some places, where they're starting to require some proof of defensible space before they will insure the property, which of course would make CAL FIRE very happy, because CAL FIRE somehow thinks every seller is supposed to do this anyway. And maybe for everybody's safety, that's not a bad thing, that everybody checks and makes sure you have defensible space. I'm just telling you as your lawyer what the law is. The law does not require the seller to do anything regarding defensible space other than fill out this form. But it does require the buyer to do something within a year after close. Which leads to another question. What if the buyer signs the form, closes escrow, and then a year go by and they never reach out to get this documentation? Do they have any penalty? I doubt it. I mean, think about it. Is CAL FIRE or your local county fire department actually going to maintain a checklist and keep track of which homes close in a high or very high? And then a year goes by, so, oh, those buyers, they bought that property at 123 Elm Street. They never called us in the last year. We're going to go out to their house. I mean, they can go out to your house anyway. They can just show up today and see if you have defensible space. Are they actually going to keep a database of buyers who haven't done it and come out? Who knows? But let's say they do come out to your property and they figure out, great, you've got defensible space, but you didn't call us in a year to do it. Are they actually going to try to punish the buyer for not reaching out to them within a year after close? Aren't they going to be more happy about the fact that the property's in compliance? Isn't that what everyone should be caring about anyway? Shouldn't we all just care that we're in compliance? Doesn't everyone want to be in compliance with defensible space for safety reasons? I don't know. So, Wendy, thank you for answering Rosie's question. Yes, they're saying no fee. That's what CAL FIRE says. I don't know about the local companies, but I don't even know if the local companies are going to do it. Somebody asked me a question directly, opened escrow in May. Everybody signed the HHDA and the FHDA, due to close in less than 2 weeks. No, unfortunately, you still need this new FHDS. Sorry about that, but you still need that form. Hopefully, I mean, you can take a chance and not provide it. That may not cause a problem. But remember, conservative Gov is going to say you should probably provide the form because you didn't do it yet. Okay. Hold on one second. No, I was going to check something. Yeah, I think that's the answer I have to give right now as far as, but maybe I'll be confused. When you say FHDA, did you mean the FHDS? Did you mean you gave them this form already? If that's the case, you're good. You don't have to give them this form again. Maybe if you meant the FHDS as opposed to the FHDA. So if that form is already given to the buyers already, you're good. You're totally good. Okay. What's the FHDA? Maybe I'm forgetting something. I lose track of the acronyms for these forms, to tell you the truth. But anyway, fair housing. Oh, I got you. Okay, no. The fair housing form is not mandatory. So we're good. Okay, yes. So getting back to your question, if you have not given them the FHDS, even though you're due to close in a couple of weeks, you still got to do it now to be safe. Okay, Jesse, in our area, they come out yearly, cite you if out of compliance, and then they return to verify that the work has been done. If it hasn't been done, there's a fine. That's exactly what goes on in Big Bear. That does not trigger this law because, in other words, they come out, but do they, if you're in compliance, do they give you a statement saying you're in compliance, or do they only cite you if you're not in compliance? In Big Bear, that's exactly what they do. They come out yearly, but they don't give you any paperwork unless you're not in compliance. So in that case, this form, since they're not giving you a compliance statement, you know, it doesn't change anything on the, as far as this form is concerned. But I think the buyer's in a pretty good position because in that case, the buyer doesn't really have to do anything, right? Because they don't have to reach out in the next year to get a government inspection because you just told me, Jesse, that they're going to come out within a year anyway. So in other words, if any of you guys are in this area where Jesse is, where you know there's going to be a yearly inspection, the buyer, they don't have to do anything. It's going to happen automatically, right? They're going to come out. The only time a buyer has to do anything is if they're in an area where there's not this automatic inspection, then buyers are going to have to sort of proactively reach out to whoever does inspections and say, I just bought a house and I'm supposed to call you within a year to come out. By the way, what about these private, I don't know about your area, but some areas I run into, they have these private inspectors who will come out and verify if you have defensible space. Maybe it's a good idea to call them out before you call the government, so they can make sure you're in compliance before you call it the government. But my impression from the government, either CAL FIRE or these local places, even if they come out and they find you're not in compliance, they give you time to fix it. They don't just fine you. They come out and say, oh, you're not in compliance, we're fining you. My experience is usually they give you time to remediate. But of course, they don't have to do that. They could come out to your property, say, you don't have the proper defensible space, we're fining you today, as opposed to giving you time to fix it. So once again, maybe you know better than I do what's the standard practice where you are. Jesse seems to be saying that in your area, they give you time to fix it, which is good, right? Okay. Where to actually find the compliance guidelines? Well, the state guidelines, you just look at paragraph 4 of this form, and it refers you to the Public Resources Code. Just Google that code, and that code tells you what you're supposed to do. Now, in other words, if what the code requires you to do an expensive cutting down big trees, then that's what's required. And then, of course, what complicates matters is, I don't know about your area, but in some areas, there are protected type of vegetation. So what do you do if the defensible space rules would make me cut down this tree, but it's a protected tree, I can't cut it down? Generally, that means you can't cut it down. If that happens, you call the hotline, we'll help you figure it out. But I mean, this gets complicated. But remember, that's nothing new. Before this law ever came into effect, these defensible space rules are in effect. And these protected habitat rules are also in effect. This is not a new question. This has always been a question. There's nothing new here. As I keep trying to say, I think we should all look at this as this is really nothing new. We've always supposed to have defensible space. If I don't have defensible space, the government can fine me today. The only thing new here is a sale now triggers an obligation from a buyer to actually proactively try to get statement of documentation. But I mean, the buyers, I would think, would want to do that. Don't you want to make sure your house is in compliance? Number one, so you don't get in trouble with the government, and number two, so your house is safe. I mean, why should it be such a big, I know it's a big deal because I may have to cut that, it may cost a lot of money to do it. But that's true today. I mean, if you're not in compliance with defensible space today, the government could come out and audit you and check you out. But I know what you're thinking, probably, well, now that's going to happen more often. You're right. And this is sort of the bad thing. There are going to be more inspections, and CAL FIRE is going to figure out properties are not in compliance, and it's going to require people to do some work that may be expensive. CAL FIRE would say you should have been doing that all along. This has always been the law. So I guess if you look at it that way, that could be a negative thing to look at, right? Unless you look at the overall safety issue, which is we should all be in compliance anyway, right? I got Julie, here's a good question. What if I don't have 100 feet between the neighbors. Well, obviously, you're only responsible for your own property. What if my neighbor 50 feet from my house, they are not complying with defensible space? So I am endangered because my neighbor doesn't take seriously this whole defensible space thing. Well, if God forbid there's a fire and your house is damaged because your neighbor didn't have defensible space and the fire spread from them to your house, obviously your neighbor gets sued by you. But maybe you don't want that. I don't want to sue them. I want them to clear their defensible space. So maybe you turn in your neighbor, you call up the government and say, hey, I got a neighbor who's it's dangerous for me because my neighbor is not in compliance. So that's a good time to call CAL FIRE, right? Justine. Right, I think that's the common situation. Reading told you they don't require proof of compliance, but they do enforce the law. Thank you for sending that. That's precisely what I'm hearing. We're hearing that when you call the locals, they're saying, we don't have resources to do it. We're not going to do it. But of course, we do enforce the law. But we only usually come out if someone complains. That's exactly what most of the locals are saying. CAL FIRE, on the other hand, has told us if it's in our jurisdiction, we will do it. Because remember, they go even further and say, we think the seller should be calling us. In that case, they're wrong. But they are saying if the buyer calls us, we will definitely come out. So the locals are saying we don't have resources. We respond to complaints. We're probably not going to do it. So in other words, Justine, if you had a listing in Reading and it was in a high or very high zone, but it's not a state responsibility area where CAL FIRE is going to come out, this reply you just got, you're going to put it in your file. You're going to give it to the buyer and say, you know, this is what we found out. This is the deal. But of course, this means B1 is applicable. But the buyer is going to figure out real quickly once they buy it, they're going to call City of Reading and they're going to find out what you found out. Or maybe as a buyer's agent, you're going to mention to your buyer, I checked for you, and they're not going to, so you're good. And maybe you're just going to give this to the buyer and they're not even going to bother to, I don't think the buyer needs to bother to call because you called and you found out this information and they sent you this in writing. So you're going to give it to your buyer. Okay. But maybe these locals are going to start changing, as Craig Whitner says. So this may trigger things, right? Maybe now that this has happened, some locals are going to be more willing to come out to inspect. The other thing that might happen that we're monitoring is CAL FIRE, since they think already that this law requires the seller to do something, maybe they're going to try to get a regulation passed that requires the seller to do something. But let me say for the 10th time, nothing in this law requires the seller to do anything unless there is a local ordinance like Truckee or maybe Paradise that requires them to do something. But if you're not in one of those areas, currently the law is going to default to B1, where it's a buyer responsibility. Yes, Kirsten, it's okay to have a seller call CAL FIRE for an inspection and then do it to the buyer. Absolutely. Maybe that's going to become a common practice. I don't know. Sellers can do that. They absolutely, and CAL FIRE would love it if they do that. They can certainly do it And that doesn't mean the seller has to fix the violation. The seller can say, I did something, I did a favor for you, buyer. I went out and got an inspection. Here's the violation list. You might as well take it. The buyer's gonna say, well, I think you should take care of it. And the seller's gonna say, no, I'm not gonna, I never agreed in the contract I was gonna do it. So you go ahead and do it. Okay. So anyway, let's see if there's anything else here I can address. So yeah, there's a certain slight bit of uncertainty and things are slightly in flux here. I mean, I stand behind 100% of everything I said. It's recorded. You have me on record as saying it as your lawyer. But anyway, see, I'm getting something about Paradise. So Paradise does actually apparently give compliance letters. That's good. So in Paradise, you're probably going to check B4. But most places, as I keep saying over and over again, it's going to be B1. And it's going to fall on the buyer. If it's a CAL FIRE area, CAL FIRE is going to be willing to come out. If it's a local area like perhaps Reading, they're not going to come out. Nick, I am not sure about Shasta County. In other words, I mentioned that we've already verified Napa, Mendocino, Sonoma, Marin, San Bernardino. We've verified some, but we have not verified any of your counties. So I don't know of any of your counties actually require you to do anything. Wendy is sending something. And as I said, who do you contact? Call your local fire company. Or call CAL FIRE. In my experience, CAL FIRE knows what the locals require in their area. Or you just call your local fire company. Said, is there any requirement here to get some type of documentation of compliance when I sell a house? Chances are the answer is going to be no, there isn't. But the only way to find out is to call the fire company yourself. When I say yourself, obviously it's really an obligation of the seller, but you're their agent. They're going to expect you to help them. And your fiduciary duty probably is to help them. It is to help them on this issue. Okay. I know you're not supposed to give legal advice, but you sort of can't avoid it. When it comes to disclosures, you can't advise helping your client. And this is the new 6th disclosure form. We now have 6. And but they're only required in high or very high. So to return to my checklist, what's new about this is affecting you as an agent? As a listing agent, there are 4 things I got to do now I didn't have to do before. Number 1, figure out if I'm in a high or very high, which determines whether I need this form. Number 2, figure out if the house is built before or after January 1st, 2010, because that determines whether the seller has to answer the questions in paragraph 3 or not. Number 3, I have to determine, is there a local ordinance in my county that actually requires my seller or buyer to do anything? I suspect the answer is going to be no. And number 4, assuming the answer to that question is no, has the seller, for some reason, within the last 6 months, had some type of inspection of their property and have received some type of statement of compliance saying they're in compliance? If the answer to that is yes, you're going to check 4B2 and you're going to just give it to the buyer. So those are the 4 things that listing agents have to do. What's the one new thing that a buyer's agent has to do? When you receive this form, you're going to look at paragraph 4. And if none of the boxes have been checked, so it defaults to B1, you're going to say to your buyer, did you notice what you just agreed to here? You got to go out in a year and do something. course, the buyer then might say, I'm refused to sign it, in which case the seller is going to have to make a decision whether they're willing to sell the house to you to the buyer in the first place. Maybe, like I said, my gut feeling is insurance companies are going to just start requiring defensible space compliance, or they're not going to insure. If that, and I've heard that's happened a few transactions. If that happens, forget everything I said in the last hour. People are just going to have to get defensible space, or they're not going to be able to buy the house, which means the sellers aren't going to be able to sell it, which means sellers are going to get certification before they put the house on the market, because that's the only way they're going to be able to sell it, because that's the only way buyers are going to be able to get insurance. So we'll see, but that hasn't happened yet. Keep going here. Allison says, you've called 3 separate battalion chiefs and they say they don't know. If they say they don't know, I would take that as there's no local ordinance. Because if there's a local ordinance, they're the ones enforcing it. If they're saying they don't know, then there is no local ordinance. Honestly. I'm being recorded. You can stand with that. If they tell you they don't know, they're the ones who enforce it. So there's nothing you got to do. Lori, property ID is including their form. Yeah, but they're not filling it out, right? I mean, they're not checking the boxes in 4B, and they're not, I mean, are they providing a blank form to the buyer? What good is that? Or are they providing it to the seller? So yeah, if property ID wants to provide this form to the seller, great. Your forms are free. You can do it. It doesn't matter who does it. But I'm assuming property ID is not filling out the check boxes in paragraph 3, and they're not checking the box in paragraph 4, right? Okay. So I think that's about all I have for you. I think we're as updated as we can be on this. The big things I wanted to clarify were the sort of the checklist I gave you, and the fact that CAL FIRE on their website says that the sellers are supposed to do an inspection now every single time they list a house in a high or very high. That is not true. CAL FIRE may try to get the law changed. We're monitoring that. We will keep you posted. But if anyone tries to tell you that that's the case, it's not the case. Okay, so that's a little problem area we have right now. That's our form says the right thing. Our Q&A says the right thing. What I just said on tape says the right thing. So you can rely on our Q&A, you can rely on our form, you can rely on me. That's the truth. We stand behind it. So we'll see what happens. Okay. Hopefully that cleared up a little bit of confusion. Hope it didn't make you more confused, but I tried to simplify it. I don't see any more questions, but you know something? I'm going to put in the chat my email address. You can call the hotline or email me directly. If you have any more questions on any of this or anything, if you have questions on anything, call the hotline or email me anytime you want. I'm not going anywhere. I'm trapped in my room. So you guys are lucky. You guys are out and about. My job requires me to sit here. But one day, I think next year I'll start traveling again. So I hope I can see some of you guys in person. Last thing, unrelated to any of this, remember, end of December. Kirsten, didn't you see it? I sent to everyone, govh@car.org. Did I not send it?
I can make sure and get that out to all of them.
Because I thought I sent it to everyone. Oh, I sent it to the waiting room. Sorry about that.
It's okay. I'll take care of it on this end.
Okay, yeah, please send everyone govh@car.org. Sorry about that.
Well,
Okay, completely unrelated, since I have all your attention. Remember, the new purchase contract is coming out end of December. Starting August, middle of August, I'm going to be teaching a lot of classes on this online, virtually. Plus, we're going to have a free webinar every week. So I recommend personally that you all take the class. It's going to be $75. That's not cheap, but I'm going to make it worth your time. Plus there's a 100-page book explaining line by line the new form, which comes with the class. So you're going to get 4 hours of me plus a 100-page book explaining the new purchase contract line by line. So personally, I think it's going to be worthwhile. You don't have to do it, but they're going to be starting in mid-August, a lot of classes, or free webinar every week. So you might want to tune in for the free webinar also. We're going to give you as much help as we possibly can with the new purchase contract. I think ultimately you're going to like it. It's an improvement once we all figure it out. Okay, it's not that complicated. It really isn't. It's just, it's worth a class though. It's worth me talking to you. A couple of my colleagues are doing it, explaining to you, and it's certainly worth the 100-page book, which you can always refer to explain every line of the form. Okay, that may be more valuable than the class itself, to tell you the truth. So that's all coming starting August 17th. Hopefully I will see you guys maybe on one of the classes. Hopefully I will see you guys in person next year when I start traveling again. Can't wait for that. I love Northern California, far Northern California. I don't actually get to your area very often, but I want to do that more often. So Sue is saying the AEs are going to make this recording available. I think you have my email. I think we're good.
Excellent. Gov, I know I speak for everyone that's participated today and thanking you for doing this and putting such effort into it. Really appreciate that. And we are going to have you do the RPA for us in November. So
Great.
that will be going out to all the Region 2 people. And then Region 2, our next program for you is going to be Department of Real Estate on July 27th. We'll get that out to you. And once again, thank you, Gov, so much for doing this for us today. I know it meant a lot to everybody.
My pleasure. See you all soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, Gov.
Thanks, Ellie.
Thank you, guys.
Hey, Ellie,
Yeah.
thank you. So it says up here, it says AEs will get a copy of this recording out to us.
Yes.
Who's AEs?
Of the association executives.
Oh.
So which association are you with?
Shasta County.
That would be Tom and Donna. I'm
Yeah.
sure they, yeah, they'll get it out to you.
Hi, Donna. So we'll get one sent to our email.
Yeah, I'm going to provide it to them and they'll get it out to you.
Awesome, wonderful. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for tuning in
Yes.
today.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Bye.
Thanks. Bye, Brandy. Yeah. It's dropping off. Hey, Donna, unmute yourself. Thank you for doing that. And who else do I have on here? Anyway, thanks to the AEs that were helping me on that. I really appreciate it. It's hard. I was sharing my screen, so I couldn't see what else was happening because if I was afraid if I moved anything, you know, who knows what would show up on that screen.
No, and Gov does a really good job about reviewing those Q&As anyway. So
He's like the easiest person to do this for.
yeah, he's so good.
Absolutely.
That was
Well, it
really
looks like
good.
we're
That was really
done.
good. I'll look forward to the webinar. We'll make sure to get that out.
Yeah, I'm gonna get some more information out on that. So I'm gonna hop. I've been on this one for a while today. Since I walked in today, I've not done anything on my desk, so probably should do that. Anyway, thanks everybody.
Yeah, you did an amazing job.
No,
Appreciate
thank
all your
you.
effort.
No, I appreciate that. I really do. All
All right,
right.
my dear. I'm gonna
Bye.
go. Have a good week.
You too. Bye, Donna.